Listen. Do you hear that wind sweeping across the endless steppes of a world that existed 40,000 years before your first breath, carrying with it the scent of ice and ancient earth and something else, something that makes your spine straighten with recognition, even though you have never smelled it before, the musk of creatures so massive that their footsteps still echo in the deepest chambers of human memory? Imagine the silence that follows, broken only by the soft crackle of a fire that represents everything separating survival from extinction, its orange glow casting dancing shadows across faces that are somehow both alien and intimately familiar, eyes that hold the same spark of determination you feel when everything you love hangs in the balance. These are the sounds of a hunt that changed everything, footsteps pressing into frozen ground as our ancestors moved like ghosts through a landscape of giants, their hearts beating the same rhythm that pounds in your chest when you face the impossible, when the very continuation of your bloodline depends not on the pull of a trigger, but on something far more profound, the intricate dance between intelligence and instinct, between individual courage and collective wisdom, between the fragile human form and forces that dwarf mountains. What drives a creature that weighs no more than a whisper compared to a mammoth, to look up at those curved tusks, that wall of fur and muscle and ancient power, and see not death but possibility? How did hands that had never known metal forge weapons from stone and wood and bone that could bring down beasts that shook the earth when they walked? These questions pull us back across an ocean of time to witness the most audacious hunt in the history of our species, a hunt that required our ancestors to become something more than human, to transcend the limitations of tooth and claw through the alchemy of cooperation, strategy and tools that extended their will across impossible distances. Before we begin this journey into the deepest chambers of human courage and ingenuity, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and at what time of day, because this story belongs to all of us, no matter how far we have traveled from those first fires. In the beginning there was darkness and cold, and the terrible vulnerability of flesh exposed to a world that had not yet learned to welcome human dreams. Picture a landscape sculpted by ice, where glaciers the size of continents carved valleys that would someday hold cities, where the air itself seemed to crystallize with each breath, and where survival hung on the gossamer thread of a flame that flickered in defiance of the infinite night. This was the world into which our ancestors were born, not as its masters but as its most unlikely students, forced to learn lessons written in frost and hunger, and the constant presence of death wearing 1,000 different forms. The mastery of fire changed everything, though the word mastery suggests a control that took millennia to achieve. Generations upon generations of humans who understood that fire was not simply a tool, but a living thing with its own appetite and temperament, its own moods and needs. Watch a Paleolithic hunter as he coaxes spark from flint and steel, his movements precise with the knowledge that failure means more than temporary discomfort. It means the slow surrender to cold, that steals first warmth, then strength, then life itself. His hands move with the confidence born of countless repetitions, but his eyes hold the respect of someone who knows that fire can turn from servant to destroyer in the space between heartbeats, that the same flames that cook meat and drive away predators can consume everything they have built if treated with anything less than reverence. Fire became the center around which human society began to orbit, the gravitational force that pulled scattered bands of hunter-gatherers into something approaching civilization. Around those first hearths, language evolved beyond simple signals of danger or desire, into something capable of carrying complex ideas across time, stories that could preserve the wisdom of the dead for the benefit of the unborn. Imagine sitting in that circle of light, while darkness pressed against your back like a living thing, listening to an elder whose scars map a lifetime of encounters with creatures that exist now only in the fossil record, his voice weaving together practical knowledge about tracking and weather patterns with deeper truths about courage and sacrifice, and what it means to belong to something larger than yourself. The fire also transformed the hunt itself, creating possibilities that had never existed in the long history of predator and prey. No longer were humans limited to scavenging the kills of more powerful hunters, or targeting only the smallest and weakest animals. Fire became a weapon that could turn the mammoth's size against it, a force that could drive even the mightiest creatures toward carefully prepared traps, or force them into terrain where human intelligence could overcome raw power. The controlled burn, the strategic blaze that cleared undergrowth and channeled animal movement, the torch that turned night into ally rather than enemy. These innovations marked the moment when humans stopped simply adapting to their environment and began actively shaping it to serve their needs. But perhaps most importantly, fire gave our ancestors something that no other creature possessed: the ability to extend the day beyond the boundaries set by the sun, creating time for planning and preparation that transformed hunting from opportunistic encounter into calculated campaign. By firelight, they could work stone into shapes that had never existed in nature, hafting points onto spears with bindings that would hold under stresses that would shatter bone, testing and refining techniques that would mean the difference between success and starvation when they finally faced their quarry. The mammoth hunt began not in the moment of confrontation, but in these quiet hours of preparation, when human hands guided by human intelligence began creating tools that could bridge the gap between aspiration and achievement. The psychological transformation was perhaps even more profound than the technological one. Fire created the first truly safe space humans had ever known, a bubble of warmth and light within which they could think beyond the immediate demands of survival, where they could begin to imagine possibilities that stretched beyond the next meal or the next shelter. Around those flames, our ancestors began to develop the kind of long-term thinking that the mammoth hunt would demand, the ability to plan not just for tomorrow but for seasons yet to come, to see in their minds the outcome of strategies that might take months to execute. This was where they learned to be human in the fullest sense, not just clever apes with opposable thumbs, but creatures capable of transcending the present moment through the power of organized thought and collective action. The mammoth hunt could never have been the achievement of a single individual, no matter how skilled or courageous, because it required something that transcended personal ability, the seamless coordination of multiple minds working toward a shared goal with a precision that left no room for miscommunication or hesitation. Imagine the development of this cooperation not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow evolution, spanning countless generations, each one building upon the lessons learned through trial and error, success and catastrophic failure, until human groups began to function less like collections of individuals and more like single organisms with distributed intelligence and specialized functions. The language that made such cooperation possible was itself a kind of technology, developed and refined through the same iterative process that shaped stone tools and fire-making techniques. Watch our ancestors around their evening fires, not just sharing information about the day's discoveries, but actively rehearsing the complex choreography that would be required when they finally encountered their quarry. Each hunter needed to know not only his own role, but how that role fit into the larger pattern, how his movements would complement and support the actions of his companions, how to read the subtle signals that would coordinate their efforts across distances, where shouted commands would only serve to alert their prey. The social structures that emerged from this necessity bore little resemblance to the hierarchical arrangements we might expect, based as they were not on dominance, but on complementary expertise. The tracker whose eyes could read the landscape like a book, interpreting signs invisible to others, and predicting animal movement with uncanny accuracy. The toolmaker whose hands could coax deadly precision from raw stone, creating points that would penetrate mammoth hide and remain sharp enough to reach vital organs. The strategist who could visualize the entire hunt as a complex three-dimensional puzzle, positioning each participant to maximize their collective advantage while minimizing individual risk. Each role was essential, and the failure of any one member could doom the entire enterprise. Training for the mammoth hunt began in childhood and continued throughout life, creating a culture where knowledge was passed down not through formal instruction, but through constant immersion in the skills and mindset that such hunting required. Children learned to read tracks before they could read weather patterns, to understand animal behavior before they fully understood their own, to think in terms of group strategy before they developed strong individual identities. This was education by necessity, where the curriculum was determined not by abstract ideals, but by the concrete demands of survival in a world that offered no second chances to those who failed to master its lessons. The weapons themselves evolved to reflect this cooperative approach, designed not as individual tools, but as components in a larger system that required multiple hands to reach its full potential. The great spears that could pierce mammoth hide were too heavy and unwieldy for any single hunter to wield effectively, but in the coordinated thrust of a hunting party, they became instruments of devastating precision. The complex traps that could immobilize creatures weighing several tons required not only sophisticated engineering, but the kind of synchronized execution that could only come from groups who had learned to function as extensions of each other's will and intention. Perhaps most remarkably, this cooperation extended beyond the immediate hunting party, to encompass entire communities, networks of mutual support that could mobilize resources and expertise on a scale that dwarfed any individual capability. When mammoth hunters set out from their base camps, they carried with them not just their own skills and equipment, but the accumulated knowledge and material support of dozens of other specialists, the hide workers who had prepared their clothing, the bone carvers who had crafted their tools, the healers who had taught them to recognize and treat the injuries that such dangerous work inevitably produced. The hunt was thus the culmination not just of months of immediate preparation, but of years of community development. The moment when all the separate threads of human knowledge and capability came together in a single focused effort. This level of cooperation also required unprecedented levels of trust, the willingness to place your life in the hands of others, and to accept responsibility for theirs in return. In the moment of the hunt, there was no time for doubt or hesitation, no opportunity to question decisions or renegotiate roles. Each hunter had to act with complete confidence that his companions would fulfill their part of the plan, even if that meant accepting significant personal risk for the benefit of the group. This trust was not naive faith, but the product of years of shared experience, countless smaller hunts and training exercises that had proven the reliability of each member beyond any reasonable doubt. In the hands of a master napper, stone becomes fluid, each strike of the hammer revealing shapes that were always hidden within the rock, waiting for human intelligence to free them from their mineral prison. Watch those ancient craftsmen at work, their movements economical and precise, guided by an understanding of fracture patterns and stress points that modern science has only recently begun to appreciate. Every chip that falls away from the emerging spear point represents a decision made in the space between heartbeats, a calculation that takes into account not only the immediate goal, but the dozens of subsequent steps that will transform rough stone into an instrument capable of bringing down the largest land mammal that ever walked the earth. The selection of raw materials was itself a science that required intimate knowledge of geology and geography, an understanding of which stone types would hold the sharpest edge, which would be strong enough to penetrate thick hide without shattering on impact, which could be worked into the precise shapes that mammoth hunting demanded. Obsidian from volcanic regions could be flaked into edges sharper than modern surgical steel, but its brittleness made it unsuitable for the heavy-duty work of piercing mammoth hide. Flint offered the perfect compromise between hardness and durability, but finding deposits of suitable quality often required trading expeditions that could span hundreds of miles and involve complex negotiations with neighboring groups. The techniques themselves were closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations of master craftsmen, who understood that their knowledge represented the difference between life and death for their entire community. Apprentices spent years learning to read the subtle variations in stone color and texture that indicated internal flaws or exceptional quality, developing the sensitivity of touch that could detect microscopic irregularities that might cause a finished point to fail at the crucial moment. The rhythm of napping became a kind of meditation, the repetitive striking that gradually revealed the weapon hidden within the raw material, each blow building upon the last in a sequence that could not be hurried or forced but had to unfold according to the natural properties of the stone itself. But the spear point was only the beginning of the weapon system that would ultimately face the mammoth. The hafting techniques that bound stone to wooden shaft required their own specialized knowledge and represented some of the most sophisticated engineering achievements of the Paleolithic world. The joints had to be strong enough to withstand the tremendous forces generated when the spear struck its target, flexible enough to absorb shock without breaking, and waterproof enough to maintain their integrity through the wet and cold of Ice Age hunting conditions. Sinew from carefully selected animals was prepared through processes that could take weeks, soaked and stretched and twisted, until it achieved the exact properties needed for these critical bindings. The wooden shafts themselves were chosen with equal care, cut from trees that had grown straight and true, seasoned through methods that balanced flexibility with strength, shaped with stone tools, into forms that represented the culmination of generations of experimentation and refinement. The length had to be perfectly calibrated. Too short, and the hunter would have to approach dangerously close to his quarry. Too long, and the weapon would become unwieldy and difficult to control. The balance point was adjusted through the careful placement of additional weight, usually in the form of stone rings that could be slid along the shaft until the spear moved like an extension of the hunter's own arm. Beyond the primary weapons, mammoth hunters required an entire arsenal of specialized tools, each one representing its own tradition of craftsmanship and innovation. The massive hammers needed to drive stakes for pit traps, carved from the hardest available wood and weighted with stones that had been selected for their ability to deliver maximum force without shattering. The cutting implements that would be used to process the kill, designed not just for efficiency but for the specific challenges presented by creatures of mammoth proportions. The rope and cordage that would be needed to secure the trapped animal or to haul meat back to the base camp, woven from plant fibers and animal sinew according to patterns that distributed stress evenly across the entire length. The creation of these tools was not merely a technical process but a spiritual one, imbued with rituals and ceremonies that acknowledged the profound responsibility that came with the power to take life on such a scale. Each spear point was not just shaped but blessed, not just sharpened but consecrated to the purpose it would serve. The hunters understood that they were not simply crafting weapons but forging the instruments through which their community's survival would be determined. And this understanding invested every stage of the process with a gravity that elevated craft to the level of sacred art. In their hands, stone became more than mineral. It became the physical embodiment of human will, shaped by intelligence and dedication into forms that could bridge the gap between aspiration and achievement. The Mammoths' passage through the landscape left a story written in a language older than words, spelled out in disturbed earth and broken branches, in the deep impressions of feet that could crush a man without the creature even noticing, in the subtle patterns of browsing that revealed not just where the great beast had been, but where it was likely to go next. The hunters who learned to read this script with fluency held in their hands the power to predict and intercept creatures whose very survival depended on remaining unpredictable, turning the mammoth's own movement patterns into the instrument of its destruction. Imagine following a master tracker across terrain that appears empty and unremarkable to untrained eyes, watching as he pauses to examine what seems like ordinary earth, his fingers probing the edges of depressions, so faint that you would never have noticed them, his eyes reading depths and angles that speak to him of weight distribution and gait patterns, of an animal's health and emotional state, of the time that has passed since its passage, and the direction in which it was moving when it passed. This is detective work that would challenge the most sophisticated modern forensic specialists, conducted with nothing more than human senses, honed by a lifetime of practice, and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. The tracks themselves were only the most obvious elements of a much more complex narrative that skilled hunters could extract from their environment. Mammoth hair caught on thorns revealed not just the creature's presence but information about its coat condition, which could indicate the season, the animal's health, and even its age. Dung deposits provided a wealth of information about diet and digestion, helping hunters understand not only what the mammoth had been eating, but where it had found its food, allowing them to predict future feeding locations and plan interception points accordingly. The very smell of mammoth presence lingered in the air, for those with sensitive enough noses, a musky signature that could guide hunters toward their quarry, even when visual tracking became impossible. But perhaps most importantly, experienced trackers learned to think like mammoths, to understand the decision-making processes that guided these massive creatures through their daily routines and seasonal migrations. They studied mammoth behavior with the intensity of natural scientists, noting how the animals responded to changes in weather, how they selected feeding sites, how they chose routes through difficult terrain, how they reacted to the presence of predators or other threats. This behavioral knowledge allowed hunters to anticipate mammoth movements rather than simply following them, to position themselves along paths the animals hadn't yet taken rather than trailing behind footprints that might be days old. The seasonal patterns were particularly crucial, as mammoth hunting was most practical during certain times of year, when the animals' behavior became more predictable, and their physical condition made them more vulnerable. During the harsh winter months, mammoths would gather in sheltered valleys where food remained accessible, concentrating their normally scattered populations into areas where human hunters could more easily locate and approach them. Spring brought the vulnerability of birthing season, when females heavy with young moved more slowly, and were more likely to stand and fight rather than flee, creating opportunities for hunters willing to accept the increased danger that came with facing a protective mother. The art of tracking also required intimate knowledge of the landscape itself, an understanding of how geological features and vegetation patterns influenced animal movement in ways that might not be immediately obvious. Water sources were crucial navigation points, as even creatures as large as mammoths needed regular access to drinking water, but the most productive hunting locations were often not at the water sources themselves, but along the traditional routes that connected different feeding and watering areas. Experienced hunters learned to read the land like a map, identifying the natural corridors and bottlenecks where mammoth movement could be predicted and potentially controlled. Weather patterns added another layer of complexity to this already intricate science, as changing conditions could dramatically alter mammoth behavior and make previously reliable tracking information obsolete. A sudden storm might drive the animals to seek shelter in locations they would normally avoid, while an unexpected warm spell could trigger movement toward higher elevations weeks ahead of schedule. The most skilled trackers learned to integrate meteorological prediction with their understanding of animal behavior, reading cloud formations and wind patterns with the same attention they devoted to footprints and feeding signs. In their hands, tracking became not just a means of following quarry, but a comprehensive system for understanding and predicting the movements of an entire ecosystem. The pit trap that could hold a mammoth represented one of humanity's first great engineering achievements, a feat of calculation and construction that required understanding not just of excavation techniques, but of soil mechanics, structural engineering, and the biomechanics of creatures that could weigh as much as modern automobiles. Picture the planning that went into such an undertaking, the careful selection of locations where mammoth paths intersected with terrain suitable for digging, the calculations of depth and width that would ensure the trap could contain its intended victim without becoming so large as to be impractical to construct with Stone Age tools. The excavation itself was a community effort that could consume weeks of intensive labor, as hunters working in shifts carved through soil and rock with implements that seem laughably primitive by modern standards, yet proved perfectly adequate to their monumental task. Digging sticks hardened in fire and tipped with stone points could move impressive quantities of earth when wielded by hands that had learnt efficiency through necessity, while stone hammers and wooden shovels gradually shaped holes that could swallow creatures the size of small buildings. The earth removed from the trap had to be carefully concealed, scattered far enough from the site to avoid creating obvious evidence of human activity that might alert potential victims to the danger. But the simple hole was only the beginning of trap systems that evolved into marvels of prehistoric engineering, incorporating features designed to maximize effectiveness while minimizing the risk to the hunters themselves. Stakes sharpened to needle points and fire hardened to the durability of metal were positioned at the bottom of the pit to ensure that any animal unlucky enough to fall would be unable to escape, their placement calculated to penetrate vital areas while avoiding damage to the hide and meat that represented the ultimate prize. The stakes themselves had to be anchored deeply enough to remain stable under the impact of a falling mammoth, yet positioned precisely to avoid interfering with each other, or creating dead spaces where an animal might land without sustaining mortal wounds. The concealment of these massive excavations required ingenuity that bordered on artistry, as any evidence of human interference would send the hyper-alert mammoths seeking alternative routes. Branches and vegetation were woven together to create false surfaces that could support the weight of a human observer checking the trap, but would collapse instantly under mammoth feet. The materials for these covers had to be gathered from locations far from the trap site to avoid creating patterns of disturbance that might be noticed by creatures whose survival depended on constant awareness of environmental changes. Even the human scent had to be carefully managed, with hunters approaching the traps only from downwind directions and using smoke and other masking agents to eliminate olfactory evidence of their presence. The positioning of trap systems reflected sophisticated understanding of mammoth psychology and herd dynamics, taking advantage of the social structures that normally protected these animals, but could, under the right circumstances, be turned against them. Hunters learned to identify the lead animals whose movements influenced entire herds, positioning their traps not just along mammoth paths, but at decision points where a single animal's fall could create confusion and panic that might drive other herd members into additional traps, or at least prevent them from mounting effective rescue attempts. The psychological impact of seeing a dominant herd member trapped could be as devastating to mammoth group cohesion as any physical barrier. Alternative trap designs evolved to take advantage of different terrain features and hunting opportunities, from the massive deadfall traps that used carefully balanced stones to crush their victims instantly, to the elaborate funnel systems that channeled entire herds toward killing grounds, where human hunters waited with spears and fire. Some traps relied on mammoth curiosity, incorporating features designed to attract investigation from creatures whose intelligence often proved to be their downfall. Others exploited the animals' protective instincts, using injured or young animals as bait to draw adult mammoths into range of human weapons. Each design represented years of experimentation and refinement, with failure often measured not just in wasted effort, but in lost lives when massive prey animals proved more dangerous than anticipated. The maintenance and monitoring of trap systems required constant attention from specialized hunters who understood that a neglected pit could become as dangerous to humans as to mammoths, while a poorly maintained deadfall might fail at the crucial moment and waste months of preparation. These trap masters developed almost supernatural awareness of their construction's condition, able to detect signs of structural weakness or concealment failure that could compromise the entire hunting effort. They became the engineers of their communities, responsible not just for the initial construction, but for the ongoing refinement and adaptation of designs that evolved in response to changing conditions and increasingly trap-aware prey animals who learned to avoid areas where their fellows had disappeared. When the moment of confrontation finally arrived, all the months of preparation crystallized into a sequence of events that unfolded with the precision of a deadly ballet, each hunter moving in perfect synchronization with his companions, every action calculated to contribute to the collective effort, while minimizing individual exposure to the terrible danger represented by an aroused mammoth, fighting for its life. The silence that preceded the attack was profound, broken only by the sound of hearts beating in perfect rhythm with the ancient drums of human determination, by the whisper of weapons being adjusted for the final time, by the almost inaudible signals that coordinated movements across distances measured in the split seconds that would determine success or catastrophe. Imagine yourself crouched in position as the great beast approaches, its footsteps sending vibrations through the earth that you can feel in your bones, the massive head swaying as it tests the air for scents that might reveal danger, the small intelligent eyes that miss nothing, as they scan the landscape for any sign of the predators it knows are always watching. Your spear feels both heavy and weightless in your hands, the product of months of craftsmanship and years of training, reduced to this single moment when human intelligence and mammoth power will meet in collision that can have only one outcome. The distance closes with agonizing slowness, each step bringing the creature nearer to the trap or the killing ground, where your carefully orchestrated plan will finally be tested against the raw reality of tooth and tusk and trampling feet. The initial strike had to be perfect, delivered with timing and precision that left no room for hesitation or second thoughts, as wounded mammoths became exponentially more dangerous than healthy ones, their pain and rage transforming them from merely formidable opponents into forces of destruction that could scatter a hunting party and end the expedition in bloody catastrophe. The lead hunters carried the heaviest responsibility, tasked with delivering the spear thrusts that would penetrate deep enough to reach vital organs, while positioning themselves to avoid the immediate retaliation that would inevitably follow. Their movements were choreographed through countless practice sessions, refined until they could be executed perfectly, even under the stress and adrenaline of actual combat. The supporting hunters played equally crucial roles, their spears and fire serving to distract and confuse the mammoth, while the primary attackers sought their killing strikes, their positions carefully chosen to provide multiple angles of attack, while maintaining escape routes that could be used if the situation deteriorated. Fire was their most powerful ally, as even creatures as massive as mammoths retained the primal fear of flame that had been burned into mammalian consciousness during millions of years of evolution. Torches and firebrands became weapons that could force the great beasts into positions where human spears could be most effective, while smoke could mask human movement and provide cover for tactical repositioning. Communication during the hunt relied on signals so subtle that they were virtually invisible to outsiders, yet so clearly understood by the hunting party that complex tactical adjustments could be coordinated without alerting the quarry. Hand gestures that conveyed precise information about timing and positioning, bird calls that could redirect attention or indicate changing conditions, even the positioning of bodies and weapons that served as a kind of physical language readable by trained eyes. The hunters had learned to function as a single organism with distributed intelligence, each member contributing his specialized skills to the collective effort while remaining aware of the overall tactical situation and ready to adapt to changing circumstances. The mammoth's response to attack was as carefully studied and predicted as every other aspect of the hunt, its behavior patterns analyzed through generations of observation until hunters could anticipate reactions with remarkable accuracy. Some animals would charge directly at their attackers, using their massive size and tusks as battering rams that could crush anything in their path. Others would attempt to flee, potentially breaking through trap lines and escape routes that had taken weeks to establish. The most dangerous were those that fought with intelligence as well as fury, using their environment as a weapon and coordinating defensive actions that could turn hunters from predators into prey in the space of heartbeats. The final moments of a successful hunt unfolded in a crescendo of coordinated violence that brought together every element of human skill and determination in a focused effort to bring down prey that represented not just food but the continuation of the community itself. Spears found their marks with precision born of desperate necessity. Fire drove the wounded animal toward positions where additional attacks could be delivered, and the collective will of the hunting party overcame the mammoth's individual strength through the application of intelligence, cooperation, and tools that multiplied human capability beyond anything that existed in the natural world. In those moments, our ancestors transcended their biological limitations and became something new in the history of life on Earth, creatures that could reshape reality through the power of organized thought and collective action. In the silence that followed the mammoth's final breath, the hunters stood surrounded by a mountain of flesh and fur that represented both triumph and overwhelming responsibility. For the death of such a creature was only the beginning of a process that would test every aspect of their skills and social organization. The carcass before them contained enough meat to feed the entire community for months, enough hide to clothe dozens of families, enough bone to create tools that would serve for years, but only if they could process and preserve it before decay claimed their hard-won prize. Time became their enemy as surely as the mammoth had been, measured now not in the patient hours of stalking and preparation, but in the desperate race against bacterial decomposition that would begin within hours of the kill. The butchering of a mammoth required techniques and tools that had been developed specifically for creatures of this unprecedented size. Cutting implements that could slice through hide thicker than a man's hand, methods for accessing internal organs without contaminating the surrounding meat, systems for organizing the work so that dozens of people could labor efficiently without interfering with each other's efforts. Watch the master butchers as they make their initial cuts, their movements precise and economical, following anatomical landmarks that guide them to the richest deposits of meat, while avoiding the organs whose puncture could spoil vast quantities of surrounding tissue. Every stroke of their stone knives represents knowledge accumulated over generations of trial and error, techniques refined through countless smaller kills, until they could be scaled up to meet the challenges presented by mammoth anatomy. The preservation process began even as the butchering continued, with strips of meat being cut to precise thicknesses and hung on specially constructed racks, where wind and smoke could begin the drying process that would transform fresh mammoth flesh into concentrated protein that could survive the lean months ahead. The smoking fires required their own specialized knowledge, as different types of wood imparted different flavors, while providing varying levels of preservative effect. Too much heat would cook the meat rather than drying it. Too little would allow spoilage to begin before preservation was complete. The fire tenders who supervised this process held the survival of the entire community in their hands, responsible for maintaining the delicate balance that would determine whether the hunt's bounty would feed families through the winter or rot uselessly in the autumn air. But meat was only one component of the mammoth's value to human communities that had learned to waste nothing from such difficult kills. The hide, properly processed, would become shelter material tougher and more durable than anything else available to Stone Age peoples, capable of turning aside wind and rain that would penetrate lesser materials. The processing techniques were as complex as those used for meat preservation, requiring careful scraping to remove fat and tissue, treatment with minerals and organic compounds that would prevent decay, stretching and working that would produce leather with exactly the properties needed for specific applications. Master hide workers could evaluate mammoth skin while it was still warm from the body, determining which sections would be best suited for clothing, which for shelter construction, which for the specialized applications that required particular combinations of strength and flexibility. The bones represented perhaps the most versatile resource of all, raw material for tools that could extend human capability in directions impossible with wood or stone alone. Mammoth ribs became the frames for shelters that could house entire extended families, their natural curve perfectly suited for architectural applications that would not be duplicated until humans learned to work with metal. Shoulder blades became shovels that could move earth more efficiently than any stone implement, while leg bones provided material for implements that combined the hardness necessary for heavy work with the workability that allowed detailed craftsmanship. The ivory tusks were treasures beyond price, raw material for spear points that would never dull, for ceremonial objects that could be carved with detail impossible in any other medium, for trade goods that could purchase resources and alliances from communities hundreds of miles away. The social dynamics of distributing such wealth required sophisticated systems of negotiation and tradition that could ensure fairness while maintaining the cooperation essential for future hunts. The hunters who had risked their lives in the actual kill deserved recognition and reward, but so did the craftsmen who had created their weapons, the trackers who had located the prey, the support personnel who had maintained the base camp during the weeks of preparation. Complex protocols evolved to govern these distributions, traditions that balanced individual contribution against community need, that rewarded excellence while ensuring that no family went without the basic necessities of survival. The mammoth hunt thus became not just a source of material wealth, but a mechanism for reinforcing the social bonds that held Stone Age communities together. The processing of a single mammoth could occupy an entire community for weeks, transforming the kill site into a temporary industrial center, where specialized skills were applied to every component of the carcass, with efficiency that would impress modern factory managers. Yet this work was conducted without written plans or formal supervision, coordinated instead through the same systems of cooperation and mutual understanding that had made the hunt itself possible. Children learned advanced techniques simply by watching and gradually taking on more complex responsibilities, while adults refined their skills through the intensive practice that such massive undertakings provided. The mammoth hunt thus became a cornerstone of cultural transmission, the mechanism through which knowledge and values were passed from one generation to the next, in forms that could be tested immediately against the practical demands of survival. In the twilight landscapes of Ice Age Europe, two branches of humanity pursued the same massive prey, across territories that overlapped like competing claims to the future itself, their encounters marking some of the most profound moments in the story of human evolution. The Neanderthals, with their robust frames and brains actually larger than our own, had perfected mammoth hunting techniques across hundreds of thousands of years, their methods refined through ice ages that had come and gone while our ancestors were still learning to control fire on African savannas. Yet when the two species finally met across the hunting grounds of a world that was ending, it was not simply a competition between predator and prey, but a collision between different approaches to the fundamental question of what it meant to be human. Imagine standing at the edge of a Neanderthal hunting camp as the scent of roasting mammoth meat drifts through air so cold that each breath creates clouds of vapor, watching these stocky, powerful figures as they work with stone tools that represent the pinnacle of their technological tradition. Their movements, economical and precise with the confidence that comes from mastering an environment that has tested every aspect of their adaptation. Their spears are works of art as much as weapons, carved from single pieces of wood and fire-hardened to durability that rivals metal, designed for the close-quarters combat that their incredible strength and resilience made possible. These were hunters who could face down a charging mammoth with nothing but wooden spears and their own physical courage, who had learned to turn their apparent disadvantages into strengths that no other creature could match. The Neanderthal approach to mammoth hunting reflected their entire worldview, based on intimate knowledge of their prey, accumulated through direct observation, and passed down through family lineages that stretched back beyond memory. They knew mammoth behavior with the thoroughness that comes from sharing the same landscapes for millennia, understanding seasonal patterns and individual variations with a precision that allowed them to predict animal movements with uncanny accuracy. Their hunting techniques emphasized stealth and patience, the ability to approach close enough to deliver killing thrusts with handheld weapons, tactics that required not just physical courage, but the kind of environmental awareness that modern humans struggle to comprehend. When modern humans arrived in Europe, they brought with them innovations that would revolutionize mammoth hunting, technologies and techniques developed in the diverse environments of Africa and Asia, where adaptation had favored flexibility and innovation over the specialized perfection that characterized Neanderthal culture. The spear thrower, or atlatl, multiplied human throwing power, while allowing hunters to maintain safe distances from their quarry, fundamentally changing the dynamics of large game hunting by reducing the physical strength required, while increasing the importance of coordination and tactical planning. Complex projectile weapons with detachable heads could inflict wounds that continued to weaken prey animals even after the initial attack, creating opportunities for extended pursuit tactics that gradually wore down even the most powerful opponents. But perhaps more significantly, modern humans brought with them social innovations that allowed larger and more complex hunting parties, organizational structures that could coordinate the efforts of dozens of individuals in elaborate campaigns that might span weeks or months. Where Neanderthal hunting groups were typically limited to extended families, modern human expeditions could draw on entire regional networks, combining the specialized skills of multiple communities in cooperative efforts that achieved scales of organization previously impossible. These larger groups could attempt more ambitious hunting strategies, could afford to take greater risks because they had greater resources to draw upon, could coordinate simultaneous attacks on multiple animals or maintain extended siege operations that gradually wore down mammoth herds through sustained pressure. The competition between the two species for mammoth hunting grounds became a laboratory for evolutionary processes that were playing out across the entire planet, testing different solutions to the fundamental challenge of human survival in a world dominated by creatures far more powerful than any individual person. Neanderthal sites from this period show evidence of increasing sophistication in their hunting techniques, innovations that seem to have been developed in response to the competitive pressure created by modern human presence. Similarly, modern human sites in regions of Neanderthal contact display technologies and techniques that appear to have been influenced by their interactions with the older human species, suggesting a complex pattern of cultural exchange and mutual learning that accompanied their competition for resources. Yet ultimately, it was the modern humans who survived to continue the mammoth hunting tradition, carrying forward techniques and knowledge that incorporated not just their own innovations, but elements learned from their Neanderthal predecessors. The reasons for Neanderthal extinction remain debated among scientists, but their disappearance from the archaeological record coincides roughly with the period of greatest competition for Ice Age hunting grounds, suggesting that the ability to organize larger and more flexible hunting parties may have provided the decisive advantage that determined which branch of humanity would inherit the Earth. In the end, the mammoth hunt became not just a test of human ingenuity and cooperation, but the crucible in which our species emerged as the sole survivors of a much more diverse human family tree. Deep within caves that had not seen sunlight for thousands of years, flickering torchlight reveals images that transform our understanding of what mammoth hunting meant to the people who risked everything to bring down the giants of their world. These are not simple hunting scenes but complex symbolic narratives that weave together practical knowledge, spiritual belief, and artistic vision in ways that speak across the vast gulf of time, to remind us that our ancestors were not just skilled predators, but thinking, feeling beings who struggled to understand their place in a cosmos that dwarfed their individual existence. The cave walls became humanity's first libraries, repositories of knowledge encoded in pigments ground from earth and bone, preserved in chambers that served as both archives and temples, where the deepest mysteries of mammoth hunting were explored through art that transcended mere representation. Examine these ancient galleries with the eyes of someone trying to decode a language that predates all written script by tens of thousands of years, recognizing that every line and shade represents decisions made by artists who were also hunters, whose intimate knowledge of mammoth anatomy and behavior informed their creative choices in ways that modern viewers can barely begin to appreciate. The accuracy of proportion and detail in these paintings demonstrates observational skills that rival those of trained naturalists. Yet the images are far more than documentary records. They are transformative visions that present mammoths not just as prey animals, but as spiritual entities, whose deaths required elaborate rituals of preparation and propitiation. The artists understood that taking life on such a scale carried responsibilities that extended far beyond the immediate needs of physical survival. The positioning and composition of these cave paintings reveals sophisticated understanding of visual narrative, with mammoth images often placed in relationship to natural rock formations that enhance their three-dimensional impact, creating the illusion that these massive creatures are emerging from, or disappearing into the stone itself. The artists exploited every technique available to their limited palette, using the natural contours of cave walls to suggest the bulk and movement of living animals, layering pigments to create effects of light and shadow that bring their subjects to life in the dancing illumination of torch flames. These were not casual decorations but carefully planned installations that transformed underground spaces into immersive environments where the spiritual dimensions of mammoth hunting could be explored and transmitted to future generations. The symbolic language that emerged from this artistic tradition extends far beyond the cave walls, to encompass portable art objects that carried mammoth imagery into the daily lives of Ice Age communities. Carved ivory figurines that could be worn as personal talismans or displayed during ceremonies, engraved bone tools that incorporated mammoth motifs into their functional designs, personal ornaments that identified their wearers as participants in the Great Hunt. These objects served as both artistic expressions and practical tools for maintaining the psychological connections that made mammoth hunting possible, reminders of spiritual relationships that had to be constantly renewed through ritual and ceremony. The mammoth thus became not just a source of physical resources, but a central figure in the mythological systems that gave meaning and structure to Stone Age existence. The creation of these artistic works required specialized knowledge and skills that elevated their makers to positions of unique influence within their communities. Individuals who combined the practical expertise of successful hunters with the spiritual authority of those who could communicate with the forces that controlled animal movements and hunting success. The preparation of pigments involved complex chemical processes that transformed common minerals into media capable of surviving thousands of years without significant fading. While the techniques for applying these materials to cave walls required understanding of surface preparation and binding agents that rivals modern conservation science, these artist shamans developed technologies that served both practical and spiritual functions, creating images that could preserve hunting knowledge while also serving as focal points for the rituals that prepared hunters mentally and emotionally for their dangerous work. The symbolic systems that developed around mammoth hunting also provided frameworks for understanding broader questions about human relationships with the natural world, philosophical structures that addressed fundamental concerns about predation, death, and the responsibilities that came with the power to take life. The mammoth images in cave art are often surrounded by abstract symbols and geometric patterns that seem to represent cosmological concepts, ways of visualizing the hunter's place within larger systems of meaning that connected individual actions to universal principles. These artistic traditions thus served as vehicles for transmitting not just technical knowledge about hunting techniques, but wisdom about ethical hunting practices, spiritual beliefs about animal consciousness and rights, cultural values that govern the distribution and use of hunting resources. Perhaps most remarkably, the symbolic language of mammoth hunting appears to have been shared across vast geographical distances, with similar artistic conventions appearing in caves separated by hundreds or thousands of miles, suggesting either direct cultural contact or the independent development of universal symbolic solutions to common spiritual and practical challenges. This widespread artistic tradition created a shared cultural foundation that may have facilitated cooperation between different communities during large-scale hunting expeditions, providing common reference points for communication and coordination that transcended local dialects and customs. The mammoth hunt thus became not just a local survival strategy, but a unifying cultural force that connected Stone Age peoples across the vast expanses of Ice Age Europe and Asia into something approaching a continental civilization built around the pursuit of giants. The mammoth hunt was never a single event but a continuous cycle that followed the ancient rhythms of ice and warmth, abundance and scarcity, life and death that had governed earthly existence since the beginning of time. Each season brought its own opportunities and challenges, its own demands for specific techniques and preparations, its own emotional and spiritual significance within the larger pattern of human adaptation to a world where survival depended on understanding and working with forces far greater than individual human will. Spring emerged from winter's grip like a slow awakening, bringing the first stirrings of plant growth that would draw mammoths from their sheltered valleys into the open landscapes where human hunters could more easily locate and approach them, yet also marking the beginning of calving season when protective mothers transformed even normally docile herds into defensive formations capable of crushing any perceived threat. Summer offered the greatest abundance but also the greatest competition, as mammoth herds scattered across vast territories in pursuit of the richest feeding grounds, their movements becoming less predictable as food sources diversified, and the animals could afford to be more selective about their routes and timing. The long days of Arctic summer created extended hunting opportunities, but also meant that wounded animals could travel much greater distances before exhaustion or blood loss brought them down, requiring hunting parties to be prepared for pursuits that might last for days across terrain that tested every aspect of their endurance and navigational skills. The preservation of meat became more challenging in warm weather, demanding techniques that could rapidly process massive carcasses before spoilage could claim the hunters' hard-won prizes. But it was autumn that brought the most intensive mammoth hunting activities, as the approaching winter created urgency that transformed entire communities into focused hunting machines, driven by the knowledge that failure meant starvation for everyone they loved. The mammoths themselves became more vulnerable as they entered their pre-winter feeding frenzy, consuming vast quantities of vegetation in preparation for the lean months ahead, their movements constrained by the need to build up fat reserves that would sustain them through the coldest periods. Hunting parties could predict mammoth locations with greater accuracy as the animals concentrated in areas where food remained abundant, while the cooling weather extended the time available for meat processing and preservation. Winter hunting presented the greatest challenges, but also some unique opportunities, as deep snow limited mammoth mobility, while providing natural refrigeration that could preserve meat for extended periods without the complex smoking and drying processes required in warmer seasons. The animals' thick winter coats reached their maximum value during these months, providing materials for clothing and shelter that would be essential for human survival through the harshest weather. Yet winter hunting also required specialized equipment and techniques adapted to extreme cold, weapons that would function reliably in sub-zero temperatures, clothing that would allow hunters to remain active in conditions that could kill exposed humans within minutes. The psychological demands were equally severe, as hunting parties had to maintain focus and coordination while dealing with the constant stress of operating in an environment where any mistake could prove fatal. The cyclical nature of mammoth hunting created its own cultural rhythms, seasonal ceremonies and preparations that helped communities maintain the social cohesion and spiritual focus necessary for such dangerous and demanding work. Spring brought rituals of renewal and preparation, times for repairing weapons and equipment damaged during the previous year's activities, for training new hunters and refining techniques based on lessons learned through success and failure. Summer became the season for long-distance expeditions and inter-community cooperation, when different groups could coordinate their efforts and share resources for particularly ambitious hunting campaigns. Autumn marked the beginning of intensive spiritual preparation, ceremonies designed to ensure hunting success and proper relationships with the supernatural forces that controlled animal movements and weather patterns. The knowledge required to coordinate these seasonal activities was itself a form of technology, information systems that had to be maintained and transmitted across generations with accuracy that could mean the difference between community survival and extinction. Elder hunters served as living libraries, repositories of knowledge about weather patterns and animal behavior accumulated over decades of careful observation, their memories containing detailed information about successful hunting strategies and catastrophic failures that had shaped community understanding of mammoth hunting possibilities and limitations. The seasonal teaching cycles ensured that this knowledge was constantly being refreshed and updated, with each generation of hunters adding their own observations and innovations to the collective understanding, while preserving the essential wisdom of their predecessors. The emotional and psychological impacts of living according to these seasonal hunting rhythms created forms of human experience that have largely disappeared from modern life, ways of being connected to natural cycles that involved every aspect of individual and community existence in the fundamental rhythms of the natural world. The anticipation that built toward major hunting expeditions, the intense focus required during the actual hunts, the relief and celebration that followed successful kills, the periods of reflection and preparation that preceded the next cycle, these emotional patterns shaped Stone Age consciousness in ways that influenced art, religion, social organization, and individual identity. The mammoth hunt thus became not just a survival strategy but a way of life that integrated human communities into the deeper patterns of planetary existence. Every mammoth hunt carried with it the shadow of tragedy, the constant awareness that the very success which could ensure a community's survival might simultaneously claim the lives of the hunters whose courage and skill made that success possible. The wounded mammoth was perhaps the most dangerous creature on Earth, a mountain of muscle and fury, driven by pain and desperation, its massive tusks and crushing feet capable of ending human lives in an instant of careless positioning or momentary hesitation. Watch the faces of veteran hunters as they prepare for what might be their final expedition, reading in their eyes the accumulated memories of friends and relatives who had not returned from previous hunts, whose bones lay scattered in distant places where mammoth fury had overwhelmed human planning and courage. These were not adventures undertaken lightly, but calculated risks accepted by individuals who understood that their personal survival was less important than the continuation of their bloodline and culture. The physical dangers were only the most obvious of the costs that mammoth hunting imposed on Stone Age communities, as the intensive preparation required for successful expeditions could consume resources and energy that might otherwise have been devoted to other essential activities. Months spent tracking mammoth herds were months when hunters could not pursue smaller game or gather plant foods, creating vulnerabilities that had to be balanced against the potential rewards of bringing down prey that could feed dozens of families. The specialized tools and weapons required for mammoth hunting represented significant investments of time and materials, resources that could not be recovered if expeditions failed, or if weapons were lost during unsuccessful encounters. Communities had to develop sophisticated decision-making processes for determining when mammoth hunting was worth these opportunity costs, and when their survival would be better served by focusing on less spectacular but more reliable food sources. The psychological toll of mammoth hunting extended far beyond the immediate participants to encompass entire communities, whose emotional well-being depended on the safe return of fathers, sons, brothers, and friends who carried with them, not just their own lives, but the hopes and expectations of everyone they left behind. The waiting was perhaps the most difficult aspect, weeks or months of uncertainty, while hunting parties pursued their quarry across vast territories, where communication was impossible, and where the difference between triumph and disaster might not be known until the hunters either returned with their prizes, or failed to return at all. Families developed their own rituals for coping with this uncertainty, ceremonies and practices that helped maintain hope while preparing psychologically for the possibility that their loved ones might never come home. The spiritual dimensions of these costs were equally profound, as mammoth hunting required participants to cross boundaries that separated the ordinary world of daily survival from realms where life and death hung in balance with forces beyond human control. Hunters had to cultivate forms of consciousness that allowed them to kill creatures whose intelligence and emotional complexity were impossible to ignore, beings that displayed grief for their fallen companions, protective instincts toward their young, and social bonds that paralleled those of human communities. The psychological preparation for taking mammoth life required elaborate rituals and belief systems that could justify such killing while maintaining the hunter's sense of themselves as moral beings deserving of continued existence. These spiritual technologies were as essential as physical weapons for mammoth hunting success, Yet they carried their own costs in terms of the emotional energy required to maintain them, and the psychological stress of constantly negotiating relationships with supernatural forces. The social consequences of mammoth hunting failures could destabilize entire communities, as unsuccessful expeditions not only failed to provide expected resources, but also eliminated some of the most experienced and skilled individuals whose knowledge and leadership were essential for community survival. The death of a master hunter represented not just personal tragedy, but catastrophic loss of accumulated expertise that might have taken decades to develop and could never be fully replaced. Communities had to develop succession systems that could ensure continuity of essential knowledge, while also maintaining the social cohesion necessary for future hunting efforts, balancing the need to honor fallen hunters with the practical necessity of moving forward with new leadership and modified strategies. Yet, perhaps the greatest cost of mammoth hunting was one that would not become apparent until much later, as the very success of these techniques contributed to the gradual reduction of mammoth populations that would eventually lead to their extinction and force human communities to adapt to a world without giants. Each successful hunt removed not just individual animals but also their accumulated knowledge and social connections, gradually degrading the complex mammoth cultures that had evolved over millions of years. The hunters themselves began to notice changes in mammoth behavior, increased wariness and defensive reactions that suggested the animals were learning to avoid human contact, developing counter-strategies that made traditional hunting techniques less effective, and forced constant innovation in human approaches. The relationship between hunter and hunted thus became a kind of evolutionary arms race, where each side's adaptations drove corresponding changes in their opponents, a dynamic process that would ultimately reshape both species in ways that neither could have predicted or controlled. The recognition of these costs led to the development of increasingly sophisticated ethical systems governing mammoth hunting practices, cultural innovations that sought to balance human survival needs against respect for the creatures whose deaths made that survival possible. Hunting taboos and seasonal restrictions emerged to prevent overexploitation of mammoth populations, while elaborate ceremonies evolved to honor the spirits of killed animals and ensure that their sacrifice was treated with appropriate reverence. These ethical frameworks represented some of humanity's first attempts to develop sustainable relationships with other species, recognition that short-term success could lead to long-term disaster if not tempered by wisdom that considered consequences extending far beyond immediate needs. The mammoth hunt thus became not just a test of human capability, but a crucible for developing the moral and philosophical foundations that would eventually be required for managing human relationships with the entire natural world. As the last ice age slowly released its grip on the northern hemisphere, the world that had nurtured both mammoths and the human cultures that hunted them began to transform in ways that would ultimately render both species' ancient relationship impossible to maintain. The warming climate brought changes that unfolded across centuries and millennia, too gradual for any individual to perceive, yet ultimately more devastating than any single catastrophic event could have been. Forests began to reclaim grasslands that had supported mammoth herds for hundreds of thousands of years, while rising sea levels submerged coastal hunting grounds that had been sites of human habitation since time immemorial. The mammoths found themselves increasingly isolated in shrinking pockets of suitable habitat, their traditional migration routes blocked by vegetation they could not digest, their ancient feeding grounds transformed into landscapes that could no longer support creatures of their enormous size and specialized dietary requirements. The human communities that had built their entire way of life around mammoth hunting faced equally profound challenges, as their primary prey species became scarcer and more difficult to locate, forcing adaptations that would fundamentally alter the social structures and cultural practices that had evolved over tens of thousands of years. Hunting parties that had once been able to locate mammoth herds within days or weeks of searching now found themselves traveling for months without encountering suitable targets, while the animals they did find were often smaller and less robust than their predecessors, stressed by habitat loss and reduced nutrition that made them less valuable prizes, even when successfully hunted. The elaborate cooperative systems that had made mammoth hunting possible began to break down as communities scattered in search of alternative food sources, their populations too dispersed to maintain the large hunting parties that such dangerous prey required. Yet even as their world changed around them, some human groups continued to pursue the ancient calling, adapting their techniques to account for changing conditions while maintaining traditions that connected them to ancestors who had faced mammoths when both species were at the height of their powers. These late mammoth hunters developed new strategies for tracking their increasingly elusive quarry, learning to read subtle environmental signs that could lead them to the isolated populations that persisted in remote refugia, where remnant grasslands survived. Their equipment became more portable and versatile, designed for the extended expeditions now required to locate prey that might be hundreds of miles from the hunters' base camps. The social organization of these late hunting cultures emphasized flexibility and mobility over the elaborate permanent installations that had characterized their predecessors, creating societies that could rapidly relocate in pursuit of opportunities that might appear anywhere within vast territories. The psychological impact of hunting creatures that were clearly disappearing added new dimensions to the spiritual frameworks that had always surrounded mammoth hunting, transforming these activities from routine subsistence practices into desperate attempts to maintain connections with forces that seemed to be abandoning the world. The ceremonies and rituals associated with late-period mammoth hunts carried undertones of grief and nostalgia, recognition that each successful hunt might be among the last opportunities to participate in traditions that stretched back to the dawn of human consciousness. Hunters began to speak of mammoths not as renewable resources, but as finite treasures whose loss would diminish the world in ways that could never be recovered or replaced. The hunt became as much about preserving cultural memory as about obtaining physical resources. The final mammoths survived longest on isolated islands, and in remote Arctic regions where human contact was minimal, and where remnant populations could persist for thousands of years after their mainland relatives had vanished, their existence becoming increasingly legendary to human cultures that remembered mammoth hunting through stories and artistic traditions rather than direct experience. Archaeological evidence suggests that a few human groups may have maintained contact with these final populations, possibly serving as their protectors rather than predators as the relationship between the two species evolved from exploitation toward something approaching stewardship. These last mammoth hunters may have recognized that their ancient prey had become too rare and valuable to kill, leading to cultural transformations that redefined the hunt as observation and protection rather than capture and consumption. The extinction of the mammoth marked the end of the most challenging and ambitious hunting tradition that humans had ever developed, closing a chapter in human cultural evolution that could never be repeated, because the circumstances that had made it possible no longer existed anywhere on Earth. The techniques and knowledge systems that had been refined across hundreds of generations became obsolete overnight, their specialized applications no longer relevant to a world where the largest land mammals were creatures that could be hunted by individuals or small groups using relatively simple equipment and strategies. The social cooperation and organizational complexity that mammoth hunting had required began to find expression in other activities, agriculture, construction, warfare, that would eventually lead to the development of civilization as we know it. Yet something was lost in this transition, a form of human relationship with the natural world based on direct physical challenge and intimate knowledge of other species' behavior and consciousness, ways of being human that had connected our ancestors to the deeper rhythms of planetary existence in ways that modern life rarely allows us to experience. The legacy of mammoth hunting persists in human culture, through archaeological evidence, artistic traditions, and perhaps most importantly, through the psychological and social capacities that such activities help to develop. Our ability to cooperate in complex endeavors, to plan and execute long-term strategies, to create tools that extend our capabilities beyond biological limitations, to develop sustainable relationships with other species based on respect rather than simple domination. The mammoth hunters who risked everything to bring down the giants of their world gave us more than stories and cave paintings. They gave us proof that humans could transcend apparent limitations through intelligence, cooperation, and courage, demonstrating possibilities that continue to inspire us whenever we face challenges that seem to dwarf our individual capabilities. In learning to hunt mammoths without guns, our ancestors learned to be human in the fullest sense, and their achievements echo across time to remind us what we might accomplish when we combine ancient wisdom with modern knowledge in service of goals worthy of our highest aspirations. As we return from this journey across 40,000 years of human courage and ingenuity, from landscapes where giants walked and our ancestors learned to dream impossible dreams, we carry with us more than just knowledge about hunting techniques and prehistoric survival strategies. We carry recognition of the profound connections that link us to those first fires flickering against the darkness, to the hands that shaped stone into instruments of will, to the hearts that beat with determination when facing creatures that seemed to embody the very forces of nature itself. In their success at hunting mammoths without guns, our ancestors proved that human beings could transcend the limitations imposed by biology and environment through the transformative power of cooperation, intelligence, and tools that extended their will across impossible distances. The mammoth hunt was never just about mammoth hunting. It was about becoming human in ways that connected individual survival to collective achievement, personal courage to community wisdom, immediate needs to long-term flourishing. In learning to bring down creatures that dwarfed them physically, our ancestors developed the psychological and social technologies that would eventually allow us to build civilizations, to create art that survives millennia, to ask questions about our place in the cosmos that continue to challenge us today. Their legacy lives not just in the cave paintings and bone tools they left behind, but in the capacities they developed and passed down to us, the ability to see beyond present limitations toward future possibilities, to work together in service of goals that no individual could achieve alone, to create from raw materials tools and techniques that multiply human capability beyond anything that exists in the natural world alone. When we face the challenges of our own time, climate change that rivals the transformations that ended the Ice Age, social problems that require unprecedented levels of cooperation, technological possibilities that could reshape human existence in ways we can barely imagine, we might find inspiration in remembering that our ancestors faced equally daunting challenges and found ways not just to survive but to flourish. They looked up at creatures that seemed impossible to defeat and saw instead opportunities to become something more than they had been before, to develop new capabilities and relationships that would ensure not just their own survival, but the continuation of human consciousness and culture across geological timescales. Their example reminds us that apparent impossibilities often conceal previously unrecognized possibilities, that the combination of courage, intelligence, and cooperation can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable when faced alone. If you found yourself moved by this journey into the deepest chambers of human determination and ingenuity, please subscribe to the channel for more explorations of the moments that shaped our species, and let me know in the comments which aspects of the mammoth hunting tradition resonate most strongly with your own experience of facing challenges that seem to dwarf individual capability. Until we meet again in the next story, carry with you the knowledge that you are the descendant of creatures who learned to hunt giants with nothing more than stone and wood, and the unquenchable human capacity to transform limitation into opportunity through the alchemy of shared purpose and collective will.